form of blackmail as they go through the new NAFTA negotiations, which have basically stalled at this point.
Well, hello, Greg, and thank you very much for joining Dukascopy TV. It's always a lot of fun interviewing you. How are you?
Pretty good. How about yourself, Jack?
I'm wonderful, thank you. Now, today we're going to look a little bit at steel and aluminium tariffs that Trump is proposing in the US. Let's jump straight into that. Who looks set to really be the big winners from this, and who looks set to lose?
Well, if you look at the news, it looks like Carl Icahn has been a massive winner from it because he, according to reports, he sold a lot of his holdings in steel and aluminum stocks. Only benefited from the announcement. I know I'm being somewhat sarcastic here, but Icahn and Trump are longtime friends or confidants, so it's a bit interesting that he makes such a trade just prior to the president making such an announcement. In terms of, now to get to where you're talking about, in terms of winners and losers in industry, it's really hard to identify who the winners are going to be. And I guess before I go any deeper, maybe I should step back.
Mm-hmm.
The president has a history of making these sorts of announcements. He's going to do this, he's going to do that. But then you've got to peel it back. And what has he really done so far? What he's done is he's stated an opinion of where he thinks tariffs need to be. You can agree or disagree with that, but there still needs to be a formal announcement and a mechanism in place for it to happen. So to be honest with you, while the markets are in a bit of a tiff, and so are U.S. trading partners, and maybe rightly because these tariffs would change the order a little bit, it's maybe too premature to say who are the winners and losers. The more worrying sign in Trump and his trade talks, and by the way, just before we got on the air, maybe about an hour ago, he's got his phone, so they haven't taken his phone away yet, and he's tweeting, about Canada and unfairness of trade with them, and using the steel tariffs actually as a form of blackmail as they go through the new NAFTA negotiations, which have basically stalled at this point. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
It's too early to say if they're going to be clear winners and losers. The last time when Bush did this, it was the American worker that actually was the loser, and nobody really won from all this. And if it does go through, you've already see Europe is talking about retaliatory tariffs. China is talking about the same. Canada is talking about the same. And let's face it, if the Japanese and the Chinese, the one thing they need to do is just stop buying U.S. debt. And that might call Trump's bluff pretty quickly.
In terms of these kind of renegotiations of trade deals, how beneficial is this going to be for the U.S. economy, or do you see it being pretty detrimental?
Take the old school economic theory and proponent of free trade and all that, and you can't really see a way that this would work. That being said, people are right in that the aluminum industry, the steel industry in the U.S. have been decimated, but they've also been decimated, largely because other countries following World War II finally rebuilt their industries, and it took them 30 years or so to do so. I think the president would be better served not by putting tariffs on imports, but rather by giving tax incentives and finding ways to accelerate investment in these industries in the U.S. That being said, there's still one overriding problem, which the math just doesn't work, and we've looked at it. There's a glut of steel on the world market. China actually has more steel, can produce more steel than all the world needs. So I don't know if there's an easy way out of this mess. But my gut feeling would be, let's do some sort of tax incentives. Let's try to get some of this industry to reinvest and put state-of-the-art mills that'll be around for 50 years in the U.S. Keep in mind, it takes about 1/10 of the amount of labor that it did, I think, in 1970 to make a ton of steel. So these moves, either way, aren't going to create a lot of jobs. But from a national security standpoint, it'll help to make sure that a strategic industry is thriving in the country.
All right, let's move away from steel and jump over and talk more generally about the U.S. economy. Let's talk about the Fed. What sort of direction do you expect the Fed to take this year, and what have you made of what's happened in the last few months?
Well, in the last few months, obviously, we've seen the change from Yellen to the new chairman, Powell, and by and large, same sort of rate of raising rates will continue. I think the one question that's starting to come into play now, and it's a bit of an unknown, is whether the Fed will accelerate their rate increases or not. And I think they could do this in two ways. One would be, and there's been talk now of 3, maybe 4 rate increases this year, and that's number one. So the interval of the increases. The other one, I think, would be the volume of the increases. Under the previous chairwoman, they basically stuck with 25 basis points increases. And let's face it, a 25 BIP increase has almost no impact. Sure, over time, but in Yellen's case, it was 2 years. And it really did nothing to kind of slow down the broader economy. But if Powell and the new Fed Open Market Committee decided that, yes, we're going to do 3 rate increases this year, and let's throw in a couple 50 basis point increases, and let's try to get rates back up to, let's say, a normalized level, which would be between 2 to 2.5%. That could, we could see some reverberation of that in the larger economy or the broader economy. I'll give you an example. There are already signs that a new cycle of distressed corporate credit is starting to perk up. The just passed tax reform actually takes away the interest deductibility for corporates. So that's going to put more pressure on corporates as rates increase. It also comes at the same time as tech giants are liquidating about $700 billion of holdings of corporate debt to try and get that, the last grasp of that tax benefit from repatriating cash. So it's an interesting time to see what will happen. I think if you put a gun to my head and say, Greg, what's the Fed going to do? I think they need to continue normalizing rates. I think the effective Fed funds rate needs to kind of land at that 2.5 to maybe even 3% raise. What that'll do is that'll give them the flexibility they need if there is another downturn in the economy, which we believe is probably going to happen sometime in Q1 of next year. We're already forecasting a major kind of market correction later this year, and we've already seen one correction already in the reintroduction of volatility into global markets. So they need to get rates up so that they'll have more room to move. I mean, it's still, what's it trading? The effective Fed funds rate is about 1.4, 1.5 right now, and the 10-year Treasury is trading at about 2.8 today. So there's a delta there. So if they do raise rates to, let's say, 2.5, that could raise the 10-year Treasury to 4. But now let's backtrack it. We talked about tariffs, and we talked about what's one of the big things that economies could do to retaliate. And sure, Trump wants a trade war. He's itching for a fight. But what he hasn't factored into all of his rhetoric is what happens when foreign governments stop buying U.S. debt. And that's going to push, the 10-year Treasury through the roof. And it's going to make it much harder for a government that's already forecasting $1 trillion deficit for this year alone to continue to finance its reckless spending.
Mm-hmm. Greg, thanks so much for speaking with us. It's always a pleasure, and hopefully we can speak again soon.
Great. You have a great day, Jack.
And you. And thank you for watching. If you like this interview and would like to find out more, be sure to head over to dukascopy.tv.